Hello and welcome to the TID Water and Power Podcast. I'm your host, Constance Anderson, and on this month's episode, we're discussing TID's budgeting process. As a not-for-profit, community-owned utility, the district is funded by our customers, and keeping rates affordable is a top priority. As such, there is a lot of planning and tough decisions that go into setting and approving the district's budget each year. On this episode, I'm joined by TID Chief Financial Officer and Assistant General Manager of Financial Services, Brian Stubbert, to discuss what costs go into developing our annual budget, what factors specific to utilities must be considered, and how the budget is funded each year. Brian, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Constance. I'm really excited to be here today. I'm actually really nervous. I'm a long-time listener to this podcast. And yes, I have been on here doing a short story before, but this is the first time I actually feel like I'm really contributing to this. And I'm very nervous. I just don't want to mess it up for you because I know you do such a quality program here that I don't be the one that people go, yeah, that just was a miss. So, people have, been telling me for a long, time that this is really my format is kind of that radio type of podcast because, they say forever they've told me that I have a face that is made for radio.
I should probably warn our listeners that Brian always comes with a joke. So we might squeak a few more out of him here before we're done today. But thanks for that, Brian. We are equally excited to have you on the podcast today. And truly, I think this is kind of one of those topics that, just budgeting in general, that everyone sort of assumes that it has to happen, but not much thought goes into how it actually happens and the magnitude of the process that it takes to pull together a budget for a not-for-profit utility. So I think this is going to be a very interesting one. I'm excited. So let's start out because, as you mentioned, you did record one of our short story podcasts for us, but this is the first chance that we've had to actually interview you. So to start us off, why don't you tell our listeners about your background and how you came to Turlock Irrigation District?
Yeah, sure. I've been an accountant for going on 28 years now. I started off working for a CPA firm doing public accounting. I did audits. I audited a lot of the local governments, manufacturing, food processing, banks. Did that for about 5 years. Also nonprofits threw that in there as well. And then I moved over into the private industry where I worked for about 11 years, and it was predominantly in the food processing industry. And so I worked for a number of different firms there. And then I ended up getting hired on at Merced Irrigation District in March of 2011. Started off there as their director of finance and then transitioned into their chief financial officer. And then I ended up getting hired here at the district in December of 2017 as the chief financial officer.
Fantastic. Well, I know that right now is a very busy time for you and your team as we're in the midst of budget season for TID. So thank you very much for taking time out to join us today. What's happening right now? Tell us a little bit about what's going on with this process.
Yeah, sure. We're right in the middle of our budget process. We've gone through a couple of board workshops, and we have one more draft set of budgets to go before the board in early December. But we are set for the board to propose to the board to adopt the budget on December 12th. And that would be not just the TID budget, but for also our what's called JPAs, Joint Power Authorities, which is Walnut Energy Center Authority and Tuolumne Wind Project Authority as well. Those are all set to go before the board on December 12th.
Okay, and we're going to get into those a little bit later in our discussion. But right now, let's get into some of that, the work that goes into the budgeting. How does Turlock Irrigation District how does that budget get set annually?
Well, first off, we are a calendar year budget, right? So our budget goes just like, most do when it's January 1st through December 31st. And so, that budget, when we bring it to the board, it is approved on an annual basis. Some organizations, they approve it for 2 years at a time. We just do it every year. And so before the next year starts, we need to have the budget approved, which is why we're going in December for a January start. Now, we always start with some sort of a framework, right? Where are you starting from? What's the basis for how you're approaching your budget in a given year? And one of our pieces of our framework is the strategic plan. And so we have a strategic plan that was from 2020 through 2025. And that has some of the main aspects and targets that we want to hit for the district in order to provide value for our customers. And so we start with that. We look at what are those, end game of where we're trying to be. What do we need from a capital perspective? What do we need from a operations and maintenance perspective? What components do we need in this 5 years that we need to set up in order to accomplish what that strategic plan had set out? Now, we're not just limited to, a 5-year strategic plan. Because we are a public utility and we have some very large assets that have very long useful lives, we look at a 20-year capital plan where we are trying to really look out there and see where we have some larger expenditures that the districts may have to, put out cash for or incur debt for that are coming up down the road that are outside of that 5-year horizon. I think one thing I would also want to add in there is all of this is done with the guidance of the board of directors. So we bring forward the budget, we put together our plan, and the board of directors, they will, listen to it. They will ask a lot of questions. They will provide guidance, and they will also provide direction for which way we should go. And it's an interactive process, but ultimately at the end of the day, that guidance and that approval is by the board of directors. And that board of directors is elected by our ratepayers within our community.
So essentially then they are the representatives of the ratepayers who own Turlock Irrigation District.
That's correct.
Okay. All right. And now this year we're looking at the budget a little bit differently than we have in years past. Is that correct?
That is correct. This year, from our operations and maintenance side, historically, we have been doing it based off of each administration. For instance, Water Resources Administration, we'd look at their expenditures as a group. My area, Financial Services Administration, we'd look at that as a group. But this year, we're changing that a little bit. We're doing it by what's called functional area. And what we're really hoping to do with this is really kind of showing where those costs within the district are and what they're going towards. One example of like a functional area might be power generation. And the power generation area might have the hydro generation. It also has the combustion turbine generation. And then within each one of those, it breaks it out even a little bit further. What type of the combustion turbine would it be? What type of hydro generation? Is it our small hydros or is it Dom Pedro? So that kind of has kind of consolidates everything into one area. And then we have our water and electric distribution, delivery and operations functional area. And so that's everything that it takes from the power lines and maintaining those to maintaining the canals. But it's the distribution of all of the water and power throughout the entire district. Mm-hmm. So instead of having a separate water section, a separate electric section, separate power supply section, we're trying to combine everything into like expenditures so that way the public as well as the board have a better idea of where we are spending our money.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay. And now, because TID is a not-for-profit utility, we're not looking to make a whole bunch of money at the end of the year. So how is that taken into account when we're looking at setting our budget for the year?
So yes, we do have many different obligations to many different stakeholders throughout the district. One of those is our ratepayers. We have an obligation in order to provide reliable, sustainable water and power at the lowest cost possible. Mm-hmm. One of the other obligations we have is to the bondholders who we have borrowed money from in order to pay for some of these large capital projects I mentioned earlier. And as part of that process, we have a certain legal requirement in order to bring in a certain amount of revenue above and beyond what our expenditures are. Also tied in with that is the rating agencies. That would be like your Standard & Poor's, that would be Fitch. Mm-hmm. It would be those types of organizations that would come in and they do an annual, it's called a surveillance, where they take a look at what we're doing from a financial perspective, and then they will give us a rating. Right now, we're at a AA- from both Fitch and Standard & Poor's. But with that, they have certain financial metrics that they like to see. And so as part of our budgeting process, we have instituted where we have, after you have your revenues, you subtract out your operating expenses, your revenue or your cash available before debt service. We want that to be at 1.5 times what the TID debt service is. we have a lot of debt service, but there's a TID debt service, which is the principal and interest payments on the TID debt. We just want to make sure that we have enough money to pay for that, plus half again as much. And so that's what we're trying to calculate at the end of the day.
Okay. It does not sound like a small formula.
No, it is not. No, it is not. Very boring, but that's okay.
You say boring. I say very important. And again, as I mentioned, I think there's a lot more that factors into putting this budget together than a lot of people would imagine. So I'm glad we get the chance to dive into it. So as you mentioned, the budget is expected to go before the board we'll be proposing it for approval or adoption in December. But when does the budgeting process actually start?
For a lot of areas, the budgeting process starts pretty much as soon as the previous one has ended.
Okay.
Now, we formally start the process around the middle of the year, but each individual area may be starting their work on their capital project for the next coming up year. What are they going to be working on? Not just to finish out the year that they're in, but what are they going to work on the next year as well?
Okay.
And so they'll start putting those costs together. They'll start looking at what other areas throughout the district are they going to need in order to work on that. And so they'll start early. But really, we start with internally. We start the process in around that June, July time period. One of the things we just instituted this year is at the beginning, towards the beginning of August, we sit down with the board and we do a budget strategy workshop where we kind of go through and we show what the trends are from, what's, our material costs going to be higher than what we'd anticipated in prior years.
Mm-hmm.
What is the power and natural gas markets going to look like? How might those dictate where we are going to go with this budget process? Are we seeing any big shifts in capital projects? Are there any new things that has happened since last year that we need to pull a capital project forward?
Mm.
Or something come up that has delayed a project and we need to push that back? But in order to be able to have those conversations with the board.
And so that's kind of more of a higher level, looking at what the current trends are and how they may affect the following year's budget.
Absolutely. That's where you exactly right. You look at your trends, you're looking at your growth rates, what kind of electrification is going on within the district, those types of large picture, aspects that might influence what this upcoming budget year is going to look like. Then what we'll look at is, we'll have a kind of a high level revenue projection, as I said, where we think we're going to end up. And this is where we really receive that high level direction and guidance from the board on what tone or, what avenue do they want to set for the upcoming year. And so that's where they provide that initial guidance to us as we're going forward.
Okay. And so that's roughly August. And then what happens in September?
September is when we go back to the board. We have a board workshop, and that's where we look at our 5-year capital plan. So, we look at the projects in depth for the next coming up year, but then it's more in summary, kind of looking at it in total for years 2 through 5. And the reason why is because some of these projects might span from year to year because they're larger projects, but also we want to let the board know, hey, there's other projects that are coming up down the road. And so they can see the magnitude of some of these capital budgets as we are putting those together.
Sure. Okay.
And then part of the capital workshop is we provide justifications for each one of the projects for the upcoming year. And so that might be, does it, fit into the strategic plan? Does it help us, have risk mitigation for some risks that might be identified in our enterprise risk, plan? And then also, is it some of them required by, regulation? Are we kind of required to have that just because it's, the state or the federal government might state that we need to follow certain guidelines?
Mm-hmm.
And then also, we're always looking at projects that might have some sort of a return on investment. We'll be able to get something back that's either a cost savings or be able to help us to increase efficiency or be able to obtain ways to bring in revenue differently than what we have before. That's all factored into this process as well.
Okay. All right. Let's keep moving through the calendar. What are the next steps?
Next would be, October, and that's where we do our O&M or operations and maintenance budget workshop. And, that's where we look at the aspects of the budget that don't have to do with your cost of power, but they're also not your larger capital projects. So this is running the day-to-day operations throughout the district. What does it take to keep the lights on? What does it take to maintain, reliability on a day-to-day basis? That's, something were to happen, something gets interrupted. How do you address that in a given time? And so those types of costs could be labor. They could be consultants. They could also be legal fees. Also, materials and supplies are included in that. And then we, during this process, we do look at, our labor year over year. We look at it from the standpoint of the labor dollars. We look at it from the standpoint of, has our operations shifted to where maybe we need to add some what's called full-time equivalents or some employees, FTEs in certain areas, but maybe, as there's other areas where they're not as needed anymore. So we can move people from one area to another. And so those are some things that we look at during this time as well. And then again, we put all of this together and we wrap it up by functional area. And we compare that with what we had done the prior year. And then our board also requests that we do it based off of, comparing it to what the current year projected expenditures are. And so that's something we're working on putting together right now for the board.
Okay. All right. So then you collect comments from the board from these various sessions that take place during the board meetings, and come back to the board with what we hope is the final budget.
Yeah, we always hope that it's the final budget, but the board, it is their prerogative that they can make any changes all the way up until the last day. Something may come up to their attention, or something may change to where they can ask us to go back and make an adjustment. We'd have to come back an additional time. But yes, we're always trying to come back on the 12th. We're hoping that all the work that's done before that comes in with a proposed budget. But again, it's always up to the board if they want to make any changes. And yeah, that's where we come in and we have the complete budget. It has the revenue. It has the capital expenditures. It has your operation and maintenance expenditures. And we look at also our miscellaneous rates and fees at that time. So we have a list of, if you need somebody from the district to come out and work on something. And, we have a list of what it's going to cost you for the equipment usage, for, the time for the employee here in order to work on that. There's also, if you need to, purchase something, as far as materials, like if there's a transformer or a meter or something like that needs to be, established or put in place, all of that is set by the board on an annual basis in miscellaneous rates and fees.
Okay. So, for example, if I'm a business or I'm a farm, for example, and I need to upgrade my electrical panel because I need to bring in more capacity, then that would be, some of those fees would be what I would be charged by the district to make those changes happen.
That's correct.
Okay. Very good. Okay, so let's dive a little bit deeper into some of the areas that make up the TID budget. You mentioned already capital and operations and maintenance, but let's go a little bit deeper into those and tell us about what makes up the capital budget.
Yeah, sure. So as a publicly owned utility, we have a lot of large assets with a very long useful life. So we look at where those assets are within their life cycle. We look at, when we think that major repairs are going to happen. We look at when we think replacement is going to happen. And so we'll kind of take a look out there in that plan and see where in that cycle do all of these fall. So that gives us a lot of flexibility when we're looking at our 5-year plan, because we also want to look at what is the cost for any given year over this 5-year span. As I mentioned before, we have first years in detail, but then years 2, 3, 4, and 5 are all on a summary level. But why we're doing that is because we want to show the costs that are coming down the road, because we do want to look and see if we can, maybe move some of those projects backwards or forwards, depending on, if we see like an extraordinary large year, we're going to have a lot of capital coming due in a given year. Is that something that, maybe that project can be moved forward? Mm-hmm. Or is that something that we can delay a year? And sometimes the answer is yes, you absolutely can. But then sometimes it's no, we really need to have this project now. Also, we have a little bit of a difference with funding. So how we pay for these capital projects differ as well. Recently, we have our reserves have been at a level that's sufficient enough where we've been able to cash fund our entire capital for the last couple of years. But there are times in which, we have our cash reserves are not at where they have been. We're starting to see those come down because we are using those cash reserves in order to pay for this capital. But then that's when we have to go out and we have to go and enter into a debt agreement with bondholders and banks. And so that's how we will also pay for some of our capital as well. So we can either cash fund it or we can debt finance it.
And tell us a little bit about, just on a capital perspective, what does our capital budget look like now versus a few years ago?
It has changed, dramatically. It was around $50 million, a couple of years ago. This was back in like 2018, 2019. Those years is around $50 million. Right now, it's about $95 million, and it's projected to be about $105 million for the next 5 years. And, the real reason for that, that big shift is because, as I mentioned, we have a lot of large capital projects. And so some of those are coming to the end of their useful life. Some of the big drivers of this are the Don Pedro Life Extension Project. That's a big project that's in there. We have a number of substations. We are seeing growth. Mm-hmm. And so it's not just new substations. We have 2 new substations going in this 5-year plan, one in Ceres and one in Patterson. But also it's just substations that we need to actually bolster. We need to actually make them where we're able to
kind of increase the capacity?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Increase the capacity of those. And I think the Roding substation is a good example of that one, where we do have to, increase that capacity. We have these large projects, we try to fit them in, and those substations are ones that were further out on our capital plan. But in this last go round, because we're seeing the growth in certain areas, we need to make sure we have those built. Mm. And so we've pulled those into the 5-year plan. And so that's, part of, what we're looking at with, this capital project. And this capital plan as we're putting it into place. And that's why you see that big increase from 50 million to 95 million. When you start adding a lot of those projects in there in order to make sure we're able to maintain that, reliable, water and power, it really, can change what those costs are from a year-to-year basis.
Sure. And I think one of those that you mentioned, the Don Pedro Life Extension, that's another really good example because, we've owned Don Pedro for 50 years now. So, by and large, it should be paid for, but that's also now a 50-year-old piece of infrastructure. And so there are upgrades that need to be made. There's renovation and some of these larger projects to ensure that it can continue to do its job for the next 50 years. So it continues to be a large capital project. Absolutely.
It's one of the benefits, but also, the downside to being a utility that has been around as long as we have, since the late 1800s, 1887. And so when you factor all that in, some of the infrastructure is as old or almost as old as we've been around. And so Sure. That takes some maintenance and some upkeep. And as you mentioned, the Don Pedro Life Extension Project, that's over 50 years old. And so now we need to start replacing those. And that doesn't come cheap.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, and I think another unique characteristic is that TID does own so much of its own generation. There are utilities out there that, import the majority of their power from other resources and don't have those internal generation facilities that they then have to pay for and have to upkeep. And so, like you said, it's a trade-off. You make the decision to own it yourself, but then you also are responsible for everything that comes with that.
That's absolutely right. Just because we own it doesn't mean that it's a bad thing.
No, absolutely.
It absolutely has given us a lot of flexibility. And I think 2023 really showed that. Mm-hmm. Because we had, Don Pedro, generation coming out of Don Pedro, I should say, that really has helped the district out quite a bit because of the megawatt hours that it provided that we didn't have to go out and either, buy power for or generate through our combustion turbine. That really had, a major impact for the district. It provided a lot of value for our ratepayers. And that's just like you said, it's a mix. And because we have such a big mix, it does give us a lot of flexibility. But with that does come that upkeep, and it does come for those replacement cycles. And it's not that it's a bad thing. It's just, it's time for us to, take a look at some of those.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it can definitely be a great thing. But just another item to factor in when we're looking at our current and future budgeting process.
Absolutely.
So speaking of current and future, how do you determine what needs come before others?
Really, that comes down to, what does our strategic plan say? What does each administration prioritize as their greatest needs in order to meet that strategic plan? But then also we have to factor in, how can we accomplish that by not having a large, fast impact on our ratepayers? How are we able to maintain that value for our ratepayers? And I would say, we've been able to do that. I think the last rate increase for, our electric customers was back in, beginning of 2015. And so we've been able to maintain that for quite a while now. But that is part of what we have to look at, is what are our needs? And then as far as then, how are we going to pay for that?
And that's something that I would imagine is being constantly reevaluated, not just on an annual basis, but even throughout the year.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. So now let's flip over to the O&M side. And you gave us some examples of what is kind of included in that budget. But let's dive into that a little bit further too, if you would. Sure.
So as I mentioned, it's the general cost to operate the district. Kind of that day-to-day, how do we keep the lights on? How is that? What do we have to do in order to, have our routine or annual maintenance, in order to perform our daily functions? As I'd mentioned before, there's the labor is associated with that. Now, I will want to pause on this one and say some labor actually is attributed to capital projects. We do have a lot of TID employees who actually work on capital projects, and so they will, code their time, or, on their time card, they will bill out to that capital project as part of that cost.
Okay.
And so that's kind of the first step of how we do that, is we separate that, that cost out into capital first. And then we have the remaining that's in our operations and maintenance budget. And so the majority of it's still in operations and maintenance, but we have to go through that process first of assigning that to the capital projects. And then, as I mentioned, we look at, what kind of legal fees or consultants or software licenses is another big one.
Sure.
We do have, a lot of, software needs here at the district, just in order to, maintain a utility this size.
That's right. The day-to-day functionalities.
Absolutely. The cost for, purchasing, various, components of what's going on, the poles, you have the wire, the transformers, the gunite, computers, all of that is factored in on the materials and supplies portion. And then we do have some other ones for our insurance, our property insurance, our liability insurance. Those are some large expenditures for the district. When you have, assets that are, some assets are, $100 million or more, you need to make sure those are insured. If something happens,
Absolutely.
You want to make sure, you have some backup there. And so insurance is an aspect that we have in O&M. And then also, we have a large fleet of vehicles. And so the fuel and diesel and, the oil associated with the maintenance and the upkeep of that, all of those go into the operations and maintenance component. And there's many other aspects. These are just a few to kind of give people a general understanding.
Sure. Okay. So we've talked about capital. We've talked about O&M, which is operations and maintenance. But there's a third section that I don't think people would really think about all that much. Can you tell us about purchase power and fuel?
Really what this is the cost to either provide power or the cost to generate power. And it's either by buying power on the open market. So we can go out and we can buy, electricity at what's called the NP15 or North Path 15, or from up in Oregon, and use transmission to bring it down. All of that is you can buy power. But then also what we do a lot is we purchase natural gas, because we have a number of, gas-fired combustion turbine combined cycle engine. And so we'll buy the natural gas, and, that is used to then generate the power. And so that budget is really, it's dependent upon what, the market conditions are for both power and for natural gas. And we've seen a sharp increase in that, over, the last couple of years. It was really low for a really long period of time. And then all of a sudden it shot up. And so to kind of give you a little bit of a frame of mind, our net budget for our purchase power and fuel was around $65 to maybe $70 million, back in, 2018, 2019. And then, even into 2020 and getting into 2021, started going up a little bit. But then really, when we saw the spike in natural gas, it doubled. It went up to about $125 million is what we were looking from a net basis.
Oh my goodness.
And yeah, and that was something that kind of hit, all of a sudden. And so that is a very important component of our budget. We do hedge, in advance. We have a 13-month hedging program, so we don't get hit with it all at once, because we've been, layering in, some of this natural gas, throughout. We have a couple of what's called long-term, tranches, or we have some long-term agreements for certain portions of gas. And that really helps us, mitigate that cost. But even with doing that, you can see that there was a large increase. Now, I will say that, here in this budget this year, we actually have seen a downwards trend on that. And that was due to, a great deal that Willie Emanuel was able to arrive at an agreement with in order for our transportation of that natural gas here. And we've seen that that's had a sizable change to the positive for the district. And that brought that cost down significantly. It's still above where it was a couple of years ago, but it did kind of cut that down in about half.
Okay, so going back to this huge jump in the cost of natural gas, how does that affect your budget in a year? You clearly have, like you said, there are certain stopgaps that are put in place to kind of help mitigate these situations, but that's still a huge change in the budget. How does that affect you from one year to the next?
Well, believe it or not, Mother Nature has a very big part to play in this. In 2023, with all of the rain that came in at the beginning of the year, right? End of December, into January, we had a full reservoir, and the rain just kept coming.
Sure. That
really increased our output through Don Pedro. And so our generation from our hydro plant really provided a tremendous amount of value for our ratepayers this year. Matter of fact, for the first time I've seen, now again, I've only been here since 2017, but I think I could probably go back, it's been a ways longer than that. It actually was a negative cost for the month of January. Wow. Now, that didn't remain. As the winter months started to go away, we started getting more into summer. We're starting to see those costs go back up again. But that's what hydro generation can do. It can have a large swing to the positive, or in your drought years, it can have a large swing to the negative. Because again, that power that's being generated from there provides a real value for our ratepayers. The more we have that, the better it is. The less we have it, the more we have to go procure from the outside or procure gas in order to generate through our other natural gas fired turbines. Okay.
So annually the board sets the budget, but how do we actually fund the budget?
That's always the key question, right? Is, how do you pay for everything, right? How do you set those rates? Well, we do have a rate schedule. And that is not something that we can just change because we want to change it. That is absolutely established, through a cost of service study and a rate making process from both the electric side as far as from the water side. And that's for our residential electric customers as well as our irrigation customers. So that's established. If we ever need to change those, we have to actually go through a cost of service study, do a rate making case, and that has to go through a formal process. But we do have other areas of revenue. That might be wholesale power. That is part of the purchase power and fuel. So if we have a lot of hydro generation, that frees up our combustion turbine in order to be able to, because we've already purchased some of that gas in advance. If we get more water coming through, that allows us to go out and sell that out there on the market. And it really is advantageous for the district. That's a way in which it's kind of we consider it a revenue, but it really offsets our power costs.
And I just want to clarify, we're selling the generation. We're not selling the water that's coming through the system.
That is 100% correct. Yes, that's a very key distinction. We are selling the generation. So, and then, another one is outside funding. And that might be, grants that we are able to obtain in order to help offset the cost of some of our capital projects or even our investments. As I mentioned, we have cash reserves. And so we do put that into an investment policy that is governed by California code. And so we follow that. And so that also helps to offset some of these costs as well. There's other miscellaneous fees, late fees, those types of revenues are included in there as well.
Okay. Now, we have a metric that's called debt per meter. What does that mean?
Debt per meter is a metric that's out there. It's not used a lot anymore, but it is still used. And if you're looking at just what it does is it takes our entire debt portfolio and it applies that across the number of meters that we have. So we have about 100,000 meters plus or minus. Mm-hmm. And if you look at just our principal and interest, not looking at some of the other aspects that might go into that debt, our debt per meter is about $8,700. Okay. And so, that's kind of a component on the debt per meter. Now, that might be higher than some of our local utilities, just because, as you mentioned earlier in this podcast, is that our makeup is different. We have a lot more generating assets. We have a lot more, invested into that, mm-hmm. where others might either only purchase or they might have some generation, but not as much, and they have more transmission in order to get power here versus the actual iron in the ground. Another tool that we use is debt financing. And so, as I mentioned, if we have the reserves, we will use the cash reserves in order to cash fund debt. But when we don't, we will fund our long-term capital projects, which we consider anything over 20 years, more of a long-term. Those long-term capital projects, we will use debt in order to fund those projects. And what that does is it spreads out the cost of that project over multiple generations and not just in one generation. But that's one of the other tools that we use as well, because, as we mentioned, TID is a not-for-profit utility. So therefore, we're trying to kind of maintain that, the revenue levels, the appropriate with the amount of expenditures that we have. And so we're trying to make sure that we're not burdening a single generation over another.
That makes sense.
And one thing I do want to mention here is, we talk about how we have those cash balances and we're setting that debt service coverage level at certain amounts. We do have a cash reserve policy that factors into this as well. And that cash reserve policy was established by the board a couple of years ago. And what that does is it kind of gives us a bandwidth in which we want to have a certain day's cash on hand looking at our operating expenses. And that also tells them, what they can or can't do with any amount over that or anything under that. So if it's over that, which is where we are right now, because our low threshold on our reserve policy is 225 days cash on hand. The high end is 275 days. Well, as of June, we were at about 287 days. So we're over that threshold. Okay. So that's where the board has, allowed us to be able to cash fund some of these capital projects. Now, if you look back a couple of years, even 2 years ago, it would say that we were at about 350 to 380 days cash on hand. Our cash balance didn't change, but our purchase power and fuel budget did. So our expenses that's used to calculate that went up. And so those are some of the things that factor in.
So you mentioned that there's a very formal process by which rates are changed or even raised. Let's talk about that a little bit more and kind of what would go into that if that were to become a consideration.
Yeah, first we need to look at what's called a cost of service. So a cost of service study is needed to determine if a rate increase is actually in fact needed. And there have been times when we've looked at it and there hasn't been a rate that's been needed, but we start with the cost of service. And so that cost of service can, fluctuate depending on a number of factors. First, we have to include all of the capital costs that we see in the upcoming time period. And that can be, usually a 5-year time period. We look at what our projected revenues, what our projected operating and maintenance expenses are. We look at what our purchase power and fuel budget, what that looks like over that 5-year period. And the fuel costs, that's really the biggest factor on, in a cost of service study, because that can fluctuate from year to year. And so, that right now would be our biggest factor, is the purchase power and fuel. And then we look at if there's anything that, any costs that need to be included in there that we see upcoming due to regulatory compliance, whether that is clean fleets or whether that is, clean energy costs. What is, the inflation looking like? What's the cost of materials looking like out there right now? An example that, I could throw out there is transformers. A transformer that cost $4,500 before, it's now going to cost, maybe, $20,000, $30,000. And so, those can have some big impacts on there.
And I just want to kind of hit on that point again, because these are supplies that used to be readily available, or at least we could get them when we knew we were anticipating needs. We could put in orders for, materials like transformers. So not only is it now more difficult to get them on hand, but we're seeing these incredible price increases. So when we do actually are able to procure them, we're in a position where we're forced to pay so much more for them, which again, what I would imagine wreaks havoc on a budget that you've tried to set out for the year.
Absolutely. So we get the privilege of paying more for waiting longer. So yes, it was like a twofer. It's like a double gut punch.
Absolutely.
When you find out that it costs a lot more than what you'd anticipated, and you have to wait a lot longer.
Wow.
And so, once you have all of your costs in there, then you kind of separate it out into its individual components. And then from there, you're able to look at, is there a revenue need or not? And then some further analysis is determined on, what type of a need is it? And then you'll just kind of dive deeper into that as you go further into that cost of service and rate setting, process. But, there isn't always a need, but sometimes there is a need.
But still, TID has some of the lowest irrigation water and electric rates in the state.
That's absolutely true.
Which has to speak to the job that the district has done in managing all of these various budget points and kind of year over year, making sure that we keep things steady, we keep providing reliable water and power, and it doesn't impact our ratepayers.
That's true. We try to minimize the impact to the ratepayers. Now, again, I might be a little bit biased, but, I think we do, we've done a good job at the district over the years, and we do the best that we can, in order to minimize the impact to the ratepayers while still providing the value that they expect.
Sure. So you mentioned that TID hasn't increased rates since 2015. But recently we did make a change in what's called our power supply adjustment, or our PSA. And that's another one of those tools that kind of helps us sort of maintain the costs that that our ratepayers or our customers are incurring. So can you tell us a little bit more about the PSA and what changed there, and sort of what value that brings to TID and to our customers?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So, as you mentioned, we haven't really changed rates since 2015, but, there is the PSA component, the power supply adjustment, and that is a line on a customer's monthly bill. And it has been since 2005 when it was first established. And so now that PSA can either be a charge or it can be a credit. So for the longest time, customers saw a 0.5-cent credit on their bill for this PSA credit. And so, that I think that credit was there since 2012. So it's been there for a long period of time. And again, that was, I mentioned earlier, is that we had very low gas and very low power costs for an extended period of time. And that's where the customer saw that credit. And so where I think having a PSA has really been a value for our customers, even though they might not, initially look at it that way, is that when the gas prices really shot up and we saw those costs really increase in 2022, that power supply adjustment did flip from a 0.5-cent credit to a 0.5-cent charge. And yes, that was a real impact to people. I mean, it did cost people more, on their bill. They had to pay more there. But what that did was it did exactly what it was supposed to do, which is to help us weather those increases in your natural gas and your power prices. And so it's the mechanism that was put into place in 2005 in order to weather those short-term swings up and down in the natural gas prices and allow you time to sit back and really evaluate, is a overall rate change needed to the base rates, or will this, just change in the power supply adjustment be sufficient? And so it went from a 0.5 cent credit to a 0.5 cent charge, but it didn't go all the way to what's called the ceiling, which is it could have gone to a penny charge. The cost didn't necessitate that at the time. Now it's been at a charge, for a little bit now. But that's something that is a mechanism that we have used and that really has helped us out. I'd mentioned the rating agencies earlier, when I was saying that, they look at different financial metrics. This is a policy that they look at, and they look at very favorably because it does give us as an organization that ability to handle these short-term fluctuations quickly. Now, we don't know if it's going to be short-term. That's one of the things we're trying to evaluate right now because gas prices are still elevated. Not as elevated as what they were, but they're still elevated. But it gives you time so you don't have to just react immediately. You have the ability to take your time and see what's the overall impact. And so that's really what this has done.
So how often is the PSA evaluated then, as far as if that should change or if it should stay the same?
Typically, we look at it, twice a year, usually that fall time period. So November, so it goes in for the December 1st, and then also in the spring, around that April to May time period into June. And so that's usually when we look at that, just from a calculation perspective, is when you see that happen. Okay.
And you mentioned that the PSA has a ceiling of a 1 cent charge. Does it have a floor?
Yes, it does. The floor is the 0.5 cent credit.
Okay.
And so it was at the floor for a long time.
All right.
Since
2012, is that
2012, yeah.
Okay.
So.
Okay. Well, that's not a bad run.
No, not at all.
And like you mentioned, that having that PSA gave us the flexibility to kind of weather some of the ebbs and flows of certain costs. And that's a flexibility that not all utilities have. That's something that TID specifically has that we chose to put in place back in 2005.
Yeah, that's correct. I'm actually not sure how many of them out there have them. I know some have recently added that to, what they're able to do here, in the sense, the big increase here at the, in the last year and a half.
Sure.
That's something that they've added to their arsenal. But, before that, there's some that didn't have that at all.
Okay, let's talk about debt financing.
Oh, I'm sure everybody's looking forward to that one. Who doesn't want to talk about debt financing? Let me tell you.
But again, a very important part of how we go about our budgeting process every year.
That's very true. That is something that has really been, a topic of conversation here at the district. There was a time here when we had over $1 billion in debt. And so, when you have a wind farm, when you have a 250 megawatt combustion turbine plant, plus other, plants out there on the combustion turbine side, you have a lot of, iron in the ground and that's, you have to fund that. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things we're looking at is what should that debt level be? What's a good debt level? And so, debt plays a very important part because we wouldn't have been able to do, the Walnut Energy Center without it.
Sure.
We wouldn't have been able to do Tuolumne Wind Project without it. There's projects throughout the rest of the district that we wouldn't have been able to do without the debt. And so you have to make sure that your debt doesn't go in at a pace that really outmatches what your customers are able to pay. And so that's part of what we're looking at is trying to bring that overall debt of the district down. We'd mentioned that the debt per, customer or debt per meter was about $8,700, earlier. That's something we'd like to try to, bring that down. Just in general, we're looking at our, debt right now. And, just looking at principal and interest, and if you want to throw in our commercial paper line as well, it's about $829 million. So we've made a lot of headway on that debt in bringing that down from the over $1 billion. Think about that, over $1 billion for a little, publicly owned utility in, Turlock.
Absolutely. That's
but
significant.
it's paid off very well for us. But now we're trying to, with our reserves, be able to bring some of that debt down into, a lower level.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't there kind of a philosophical approach to debt financing as well? That some, at times our board may be more, have a appetite for carrying more debt at certain times than using our reserves to pay down that debt.
Absolutely. There is that philosophical, difference as well. And when the debt was, put on, again, I mentioned Walnut Energy Center, Almond 2, those are large generating facilities. Tuolumne Wind Project, which is a wind farm up in the state of Washington. And those are large capital projects where the district is investing in the future of power, renewable power, making sure that we're sustainable, that we are able to meet the needs. But that comes with, with a price tag. And so that's not something when you have a $300 or $400 million project, you can't just go out there and say, okay, I'm going to use all of the reserves for that.
Sure.
That's when you debt finance it. And that's when you pay that off over, a period of time. But when you do have the reserves and you do have that cash balance, you want to put that into good use for our customers as well. And so that's when you use those funds in order to pay some of your ongoing or upcoming capital projects that warrant that, to the extent that you can. But you always monitor that to see when you should be using debt and when you can still continue to use your cash. And so that's what we've been doing over the last, I'd say, 5 to 6 years, is really looking at that balance. And, we've been in a fortunate situation with the reserve that we're able to continue to cash fund, which helps us bring those debt levels down. But there's going to come a time here where we're going to have to go back to the debt financing. And that's okay. That's appropriate. That's what we should do.
Sure.
We want to make sure that we're good stewards and provide value for our customers. And so we're always trying to find that balance. I know I mentioned that we did have the debt, but, I had mentioned TID debt earlier, but we actually have 3 different types of, entities within TID that has debt.
Okay.
So there's TID proper, which is kind of more just your whatever impacts the district in general. That's the debt that's associated there. But we also have the Walnut Energy Center Authority, which is a joint power authority between ourselves and Merced Irrigation District. And that was formed back in 2003. And really the whole purpose of that was to develop, own, and operate the Walnut Energy Center. And then in 2008, another JPA was formed between WECA as well as TID, and that was to develop, own, and operate the Tuolumne Wind Project Authority. That's the TWPA JPA. And that was for a 136.6 megawatt wind farm up in the state of Washington, as I'd mentioned earlier. And so, the reason why we have that debt separately is because it is a JPA. It kind of falls under a little bit of different rules as far as how that debt is counted for the district with our bondholders. Because we at TID, we actually guarantee that we are going to pay all the operating, capital, and debt costs of each one of those JPAs, that it's actually doesn't fall into that category. We have to have extra, that I mentioned earlier, we did 1.5 times debt of TID debt. Well, when you get into the JPAs, you just have to show that you're paying that. So we build those debt costs into the O&M budget. That's one of the larger components. In 2023, it's about $47 million of principal and interest for just those 2 JPAs.
Okay.
So when you add all of the debt up for TID, principal and interest, that's the WECA JPA, Tuolumne Wind JPA, and TID debt. It's about over $85 million. And that's what we pay on an annual basis, just in principal and interest.
Okay. Wow. And what are some of the district's debt options then?
So one of the options that we have at the district is to use short-term financing. And what we use is commercial paper program. And that's the vehicle that we use from a short-term perspective. And that's where we establish a letter of credit that can last anywhere from 1 to 3 years with a bank. And then what we'll do is we'll issue a commercial paper backed by that letter of credit. And that has a maturity that can be no more than 270 days. So you have that 1 to 3 year letter of credit, but the actual maturity of the commercial paper can be no more than 270 days. We used to have a commercial paper line for both TID as well as WECA, but right now we just have it for WECA. The reason why is because we have about $27 million still on that line. For TID, that expired back in 2020. That letter of credit expired. And at the time, when we went out to bid, we only had one bid, one banking entity bid on that one. And it was for just the fee for having the letter of credit was 0.75%. We weren't anticipating needing to use that. It was just more of a just in case.
Okay.
And so that was something that was going to be way too expensive for our ratepayers, just for a just in case, because we can always wait. And it was only going to be for a year. We could wait till the end of that year, reevaluate it, and see if we needed it again. We still haven't needed to enter back into that. We are waiting until we have that debt need, and then we'll start that up again for the TID side.
Okay.
Now, once that commercial paper line, if we do enter into it again, what would happen is we can reimburse ourselves for expenditures that we've made as a district for capital projects. And so for capital projects, you can, as a public utility, we're able to have tax exempt commercial paper and tax exempt bonds. Mm. And so what we would have is we would fill up that commercial paper line, if it's $50 million, $100 million, whatever that happens to be. And then once that gets full, then you would then roll that into a longer term bond, a 30-year bond. Usually try to time that when you're having a refunding or refinancing of other debt that's out there, but sometimes that doesn't happen, and you have to do it just in and of itself. And so those are some of the things that we use use the commercial paper for, and then we have the other for a longer term is bonds. I'd mentioned that, and so we could do a new issuance. That's where we roll the commercial paper into that bond, okay. And that's where as I mentioned, you'd issue that debt first. And then you'd fund the projects as they occur. And that typically can go 30 years is, what a bond would go out for. But, sometimes you can do it for 20 years. It just depends on if you have the assets or don't have as long of a life. Mm-hmm. If you have the capacity as far as being able to pay for those bonds without having, overly, having too much of an impact on your ratepayers. Some people will go shorter than that. And so, that's when we have, our bonds. Our last issuance was, I want to say in 2020 was when we did our last issuance. And, the projects that we do it for, they can vary. As I mentioned, Walnut Energy Center Authority, that was built using the bonds. Tuolumne Wind Project Authority, that was built using the bonds. There's times in which, we have our, depending on the projects, it could be, a substation or transmission that's being added. These larger, longer term capital projects are what's being included in these bonds. And each bond varies on what you put in there, but those are the types of expenditures that you would see in there. Now, these bonds, you're able to what's called refund them, or really most people more refinancing them. Okay. But you can't do it for 10 years. But really what you're trying to do is match the length of time of your assets to the length of term of your bond that you're putting it out there. And so, again, that refunding of the bond, the last time we did that was in 2020. We did a combination of a refunding as well as adding new money to it at that time period, because that way you're able to, maximize and have, be more efficient in your issuance costs, because if you're going to go through it in one process, you're going to have the same people working on it. You have one rating agency invoice, one, legal opinion, all that stuff goes into one. So you're able to, kind of just bring that all together.
Now, you mentioned that TID's overall debt level has come down in recent years. Does TID have specific debt goals? Is there a kind of a threshold we're looking to meet, or?
What we're trying to do is there's no formal goal of what we're trying to reach. what we're trying to do is make sure that our debt is appropriate for the type of assets that we have, meaning we're very heavily on the generation, which means you're going to have to invest in that. But as you see those investments are ending their into their life, we're either going to need to reinvest and come up with have new debt for some of those, or we're going to have other operating expenses, whether that's a power purchase agreement or something like that takes its place. So if you end up with a power purchase agreement, you would see that debt level drop off. If you see if you have to reinvest, then you would see at least a portion of those expenditures coming back on. And so, really, I would say if you were to take out some of the generating facilities, I would like to see our debt level at about that $400 to $500 million range. I think that would be appropriate. But again, I haven't done a complete analysis of that one yet. That's just a little bit more, general feel for where that would be.
Okay. Any other funding mechanisms that TID relies on when putting together our budget?
Yes, we do. We have a number of different funding mechanisms. Some of the things we're looking at is for grants. The Ceres Main regulating reservoir, that was, grant funded. The Harding-Nielsen fish barrier, that had some grants associated with that. And then also we look for partnerships. What are some areas where we can partner with other agencies in order to work on a project that's mutually beneficial? And so Project Nexus is an example of that one, where we partnered with the state, partnered with UC, the UC system, just to make sure that we, had everything that we needed. And then also we're looking at, pursuit of, are there other things that we can maximize or other revenue sources that we can use. I'd mentioned interest income before. That's another one, that we use in order to help offset. But then also our wholesale sales. That is a mechanism that is used in order to help reduce our expenditures. So when we have those good hydro generation years, that does free up some of our generation to be used elsewhere. Because as I mentioned, we might not necessarily know we're going to have that good of a hydro month or that good of a hydro year, but we've already purchased some of that natural gas. And so that, helps out in those areas. And then EIM, the energy imbalance market. That's something that has really unlocked a lot of potential for us as far as greater value from those thermal units. Again, that's really a lot in conjunction with, other, if we have other generation like hydro generation, that really helps out in those areas. But those are some aspects that we're looking at as far as, other funding mechanisms when it presents itself. We're not going to put, anything of the district or ratepayers or reliability at stake on this. Mm-hmm. We're not necessarily going out and trying to, find this or search it down. But when those opportunities do present themselves and we have the resources in order to be able to tackle it, we do use those as well.
And so just to kind of recap that, with regard to wholesale sales, like you mentioned, we had a really great hydro year. So we generated a lot using our hydro facilities, which then freed up some of our other facilities, our natural gas plants, that could also come online and generate strictly from a sales perspective, from an economic perspective, to be able to put that generation on the market and have that available for sale, which then turns into revenue for the district.
That's correct.
Okay. So many, many, many different aspects to consider when building out the budget. Let's take a look forward now at future projects and initiatives that might come into play in future budgeting cycles. Specifically, renewable energy mandates. What can you tell us about those and how those might affect future budgets?
Yeah, the regulation that comes down from energy mandates, that's going to require us to look at our future costs, whether that is capital that we need to invest in, or whether, as I mentioned, that's a power purchase agreement. Those are factors that change all the time, and the cost of that change as well as things get more efficient, as resources become more scarce. Those also factor into this, and so we do have to look at those projects. We have to look at those initiatives. We have to see where do those fit into the 5-year and 20-year horizon.
Makes sense. Okay, so December rolls around. The budget is adopted by the TID Board of Directors. We have our marching orders, so to speak, for the next year. What happens throughout the year then with regard to managing that budget or tracking that budget?
So that's a great question. From the budget tracking, once the budget is hit, we look at our expenditures on a monthly basis. And so we will compare our budget to our actual. And that's all the way down to the department and to the division manager level, looking to see, are we on track? Are there new unknown things that may have hit that you have to account for? Or maybe there's some items that we thought we were going to have this year that didn't actually occur and we know is going to be pushed off. But that happens on a monthly basis. And then we actually present the financial statements as well as the expenditures to the board on a quarterly basis. And then starting in the second quarter, we actually include year-end projections in there about how we're tracking towards our capital projects, our O&M, purchase power and fuel, and even how are we doing as far as a revenue perspective to give that board a holistic view of where we are and where we think we're going to end up. Now, the closer you get to the end of the year, the better your projections become. But we try to give the board the best information we have at the time. And then the other thing that we do is on a monthly basis, we do provide what's kind of key financial update to the board members, where we look at retail revenues, we look at purchase power and fuel, the wholesale revenues, we look at our, the wind sales that we'd mentioned, and then as well as our capital. How are we doing according to budget? And then the other component in there is interest income as well. And so we just kind of track that and we kind of let the board know how each month did as we're going through.
Okay. Well, Brian, we're coming to the end of our time together. Is there anything else we haven't touched on yet with regard to building out the TID budget that our listeners should know?
No, I think we've tortured our listeners enough hearing about the budget, but no, I really can't think of anything. And I do think you do a fantastic job. I've listened to, I think everyone or almost every one of them, and you do an amazing job on this, and do just appreciate just the invite and being able to attend.
Well, we appreciate having you on to discuss really a very important part of how the district does its business on a day-to-day format. So thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. Thank you for tuning in to the TID Water and Power Podcast. You can find TID on Facebook at facebook.com/TurlockID, on Instagram and Twitter at TurlockID, and on LinkedIn as the Turlock Irrigation District. I'm your host, Constance Anderson. We'll see you again next time.